Karen Matthews had always been the type of person who acted first and thought later. At 34, she worked as a public relations manager for a small advertising firm in downtown Chicago, but her real passion lay in activism and social justice causes. She had organized countless protests, written letters to politicians, and even spent a night in jail after chaining herself to a tree that was scheduled to be cut down for a shopping mall development. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, Karen found herself standing outside the British Embassy with about 200 other protesters. They had gathered to demonstrate against what they saw as unfair trade policies that were affecting American workers. The crowd was peaceful, holding signs and chanting slogans, but the energy was building as more people arrived throughout the morning. Karen had arrived early, around 7 in the morning, wearing her favorite protest outfit, comfortable sneakers, jeans, and a bright red t-shirt with "Justice for Workers" printed across the front. She carried a homemade sign that read, "Fair Trade, Fair Wages," in bold black letters. The weather was crisp but sunny, and she felt optimistic about making their voices heard. As the morning progressed, Karen noticed the increased security presence around the embassy. Royal Guards in their distinctive red uniforms and tall black hats stood at attention near the entrance, while additional security personnel in plain clothes moved through the crowd. She had seen these guards before during previous protests, and they had always maintained their stoic, professional demeanor regardless of what was happening around them. Around 10:30, a group of more aggressive protesters arrived. Unlike the peaceful demonstrators who had been there since early morning, these newcomers seemed agitated and ready for confrontation. They pushed their way to the front of the crowd, shouting louder slogans and gesticulating wildly. Karen felt uncomfortable with their energy but decided to stay put, believing that her peaceful presence might help maintain the demonstration's non-violent nature. The situation began to escalate when one of the aggressive protesters threw a plastic water bottle toward the embassy entrance. It fell harmlessly on the pavement, but the gesture caused the security personnel to become more alert. Karen watched as the Royal Guards maintained their positions, but their eyes now tracked the movements of the crowd more carefully. Then someone in the aggressive group shouted something about storming the embassy, and suddenly the peaceful demonstration transformed into something much more dangerous. People began pushing forward, and Karen found herself caught in the surge of bodies moving toward the embassy entrance. She tried to move sideways to get out of the crowd, but there were too many people pressed around her. In the chaos that followed, Karen saw one of the Royal Guards step forward to try to control the situation. He raised his rifle not to threaten anyone, but to signal for backup and to establish a clear boundary that the protesters should not cross. The guard was young, probably in his early 20s, with a serious expression that spoke of his training and dedication to his duty. As the crowd pushed forward more aggressively, Karen found herself directly in front of this young guard. She could see the tension in his face as he tried to maintain order while following his protocols. Behind her, she could hear someone shouting about taking action, about not letting the government ignore them anymore. The energy of the crowd was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Without warning, someone from behind shoved Karen forward hard, and she stumbled directly into the Royal Guard. He was caught off balance, trying to maintain his grip on his rifle while also attempting to steady himself. In that split second of confusion and physical contact, Karen's hands instinctively reached out to break her fall, and somehow, her fingers wrapped around the barrel of the guard's rifle. The moment seemed to stretch forever as both Karen and the guard realized what was happening. His training told him to maintain control of his weapon at all costs, while Karen's reflexes told her to hold on to whatever would prevent her from falling. For just a few seconds, they were both gripping the rifle, their eyes meeting in mutual shock and growing panic. The guard tried to pull the rifle back toward himself, but Karen's grip was strong and the angle was awkward. Other protesters around them had noticed what was happening and were shouting, some encouraging Karen to take the weapon, others telling her to let go immediately. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than either of them could process. Then, in one decisive moment, the guard lost his grip. Maybe it was because of the awkward angle, maybe because another protester bumped into him from the side, or maybe because Karen's adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. Whatever the reason, the rifle slipped from his hands and into hers. For one terrifying instant, Karen Matthews, a public relations manager who had never held a weapon in her life, found herself holding a Royal Guards rifle in the middle of an increasingly chaotic protest. The weight of the weapon shocked her, heavier than she had expected, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Around her, the crowd had noticed what occurred. Some people were cheering, thinking that Karen had somehow captured a weapon from the authorities. Others were screaming at her to drop it immediately. The young guard stood in front of her, his face pale with shock and fear, while his colleagues began moving rapidly toward their position. Karen looked down at the rifle in her hands, then back up at the guard's face. In that moment, she realized that what had started as an accident was about to become something much more serious. She could see backup guards approaching quickly, security personnel speaking rapidly into their radios, and the crowd around her becoming more agitated and unpredictable. The weight of her mistake began to settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She had come to the protest to peacefully advocate for workers' rights, and now she was holding a weapon that belonged to a foreign government security force. Everything she believed in about peaceful protest and nonviolent resistance seemed to crumble in the face of this moment of chaos and poor judgment. The seconds that followed felt like hours to Karen as she stood frozen with the rifle in her hands. The young Royal Guard, whose weapon she now held, was staring at her with a mixture of professional training and human fear. His name tag read Thompson, and Karen could see that he was probably someone's son, maybe even younger than her own nephew back home in Ohio. "Ma'am, please put down the weapon immediately," Thompson said in a steady voice that barely concealed his anxiety. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but probably not for having his rifle taken by a middle-aged American woman at a peaceful protest gone wrong. Karen wanted to comply immediately, but the crowd around them had become a living, breathing entity with its own momentum. Some protesters were shouting at her to keep the weapon, claiming it was a symbol of standing up to authority. Others were begging her to drop it before someone got hurt. The noise was overwhelming, and Karen felt like she was drowning in the chaos of voices and pushing bodies. More Royal Guards were approaching quickly, their movements coordinated and professional. Karen could see that they were surrounding her position, creating a perimeter that would prevent her escape even if she wanted to run. Behind them, she spotted what appeared to be embassy security personnel and possibly even local police officers responding to the situation. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Karen said to Thompson, raising her voice to be heard over the crowd. "I was falling, and I just grabbed onto something. I don't want your gun." But even as she spoke these words, Karen realized how hollow they sounded. Intent didn't matter now. What mattered was that an American citizen was holding a British Royal Guards weapon outside their embassy, surrounded by an increasingly agitated crowd of protesters. The optics were terrible, and the potential consequences were beginning to dawn on her. A senior guard, identified by additional insignia on his uniform, stepped forward with his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, my name is Sergeant Williams. I need you to very slowly place the weapon on the ground and step away from it. No one wants anyone to get hurt here today." Karen looked around at the faces surrounding her. The crowd had grown larger as word of the incident spread through the protest. Some people were recording everything on their phones, and Karen realized that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media, and possibly even the news. Her moment of accidental involvement in this chaos was about to become very public. "I want to put it down," Karen said, her voice cracking slightly. "But everyone is pushing, and I'm scared I might accidentally hurt someone if I try to move." It was true. The crowd was pressed so tightly around the confrontation that Karen couldn't see a clear space on the ground where she could safely place the rifle. Every time she tried to move, people pushed closer, either trying to get a better view or attempting to insert themselves into the situation. Sergeant Williams seemed to recognize the problem. He began speaking to his colleagues, and within moments, they had started creating a wider perimeter, gently but firmly pushing the crowd back to give Karen some space. The protesters resisted at first, but the professional manner of the guards and the obvious seriousness of the situation eventually convinced most people to step back. As the space around her cleared, Karen felt some of the immediate physical pressure relief, but the psychological pressure intensified. Now she was clearly visible to everyone present, including what she assumed were undercover security personnel who had been photographing and possibly filming the entire incident. "Okay, I'm going to put it down now," Karen announced, though her hands were shaking so badly that she was afraid she might drop the weapon rather than place it safely. The adrenaline that had carried her through the first few minutes was beginning to wear off, replaced by the crushing realization of what she had done. Thompson stepped slightly closer. "Ma'am, please hold it by the barrel, away from the trigger, and just crouch down slowly and set it on the pavement." Karen followed his instructions carefully, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone around her could hear it. As she crouched down and placed the rifle on the ground, she felt an enormous sense of relief, followed immediately by a new wave of anxiety about what would happen next. The moment the weapon left her hands, Thompson quickly moved forward and secured it, checking it professionally before stepping back to a safe distance. The other guards maintained their positions, but Karen could sense a slight relaxation in their posture now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your back," Sergeant Williams said, producing a set of handcuffs from his belt. "You're being detained for questioning regarding this incident." The reality of being arrested hit Karen like a physical blow. She had been to protests before, had even been arrested once for civil disobedience, but this was different. This involved international security, weapons, and what could potentially be seen as a threat to foreign diplomats or embassy personnel. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Karen heard the crowd behind her erupting in mixed reactions. Some people were angry that she was being arrested, shouting that she had done nothing wrong and was being persecuted for exercising her right to protest. Others seemed to think she deserved whatever punishment she received for escalating a peaceful demonstration into a security incident. "Am I under arrest?" Karen asked as Sergeant Williams began leading her toward the embassy entrance. "You're being detained while we determine exactly what charges, if any, will be filed," he replied. "This is a serious matter that involves multiple jurisdictions and international protocols. There are procedures that must be followed." As they walked, Karen caught sight of her reflection in the embassy's glass doors. She looked like exactly what she was, a regular person who had found herself in an extraordinary and frightening situation through a combination of bad luck, poor judgment, and circumstance. Her red t-shirt, which had seemed like such an appropriate choice for a peaceful protest that morning, now felt like a target that made her stand out in all the wrong ways. Behind her, she could hear the crowd beginning to disperse as police officers arrived on the scene to restore order. The protest that had brought her there in the first place seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the immediate concerns of her current situation. She wondered if her employer would see this on the news, what her family would think, and whether this moment of chaos would define the rest of her life. Inside the British Embassy, Karen found herself in a small, windowless room that felt more like an office than an interrogation chamber. The walls were painted a neutral beige color, and the only furniture consisted of a simple table and 3 chairs. Sergeant Williams had removed her handcuffs once they were inside, though he remained in the room along with another embassy security official who had introduced himself as Mr. Peterson. "Ms. Matthews, Peterson began, consulting a clipboard with her information that had apparently been gathered quickly from her identification. "I want to be clear about your situation. You're not under arrest at this moment, but you are being held for questioning regarding a serious security incident involving embassy property and personnel." Karen nodded, though she felt far from clear about anything that was happening to her. The adrenaline had completely worn off now, leaving her feeling exhausted and slightly nauseated. She kept replaying the incident in her mind, wondering if she could have done anything differently to avoid ending up in this room. "I want to cooperate completely," Karen said. "I need you to understand that I never intended to take anyone's weapon. I was falling, people were pushing, and I just grabbed onto whatever was closest to break my fall. When I realized what I was holding, I wanted to give it back immediately." Peterson made notes on his clipboard as she spoke. "We have multiple witnesses to the incident, as well as video footage from embassy security cameras. The preliminary evidence does support your account that this began as an accidental contact during crowd movement." This was the first piece of potentially good news Karen had heard since the incident began, and she felt a small wave of relief. If the video showed that she hadn't intentionally grabbed for the rifle, perhaps the consequences wouldn't be as severe as she had been imagining. "However," Peterson continued, "the fact remains that embassy security was compromised, a weapon was temporarily removed from the control of authorized personnel, and the incident occurred in front of a large crowd during what was already a tense situation. These factors complicate the matter significantly." A new person entered the room, a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI. Karen's heart sank again as she realized that American law enforcement was now involved in addition to British embassy security. "Ms. Matthews, I'm here because any incident involving foreign embassy security on American soil requires federal investigation," Agent Chen explained, taking the third chair at the table. "I want to assure you that we're treating this as an incident to be investigated rather than assuming criminal intent. But I do need to ask you some questions about your background and your presence at today's protest." For the next 2 hours, Karen found herself answering detailed questions about her involvement in various activist causes, her employment history, her financial situation, and her reasons for attending the protest. Agent Chen was professional but thorough, clearly following established protocols for investigating potential security threats. Karen learned that the incident had indeed been captured on multiple security cameras, and that the footage supported her claim that the initial contact with Thompson had been accidental. However, she also learned that some of the protesters in the crowd had previous arrests for more serious offenses, and that embassy security had been heightened recently due to unspecified threats. "The good news," Agent Chen said after consulting with Peterson privately, "is that the evidence clearly shows this was an accident rather than a planned attempt to seize a weapon. The challenging news is that procedures require a complete investigation, and there may still be consequences even for an accidental security breach." Around 3 in the afternoon, Karen was finally allowed to call her sister Jennifer, who lived in nearby Arlington. Jennifer arrived at the embassy an hour later with a lawyer friend named David Reeves, who specialized in federal criminal defense. "Karen, what on earth were you thinking?" Jennifer asked, after they were allowed a private consultation in another small room. "I wasn't thinking," Karen replied honestly. "It happened so fast. And then suddenly I was holding this rifle and everyone was screaming and I didn't know what to do." David Reeves reviewed the preliminary information that the authorities were willing to share. "The fact that video evidence supports your account of accidental contact is crucial," he explained. "However, there are still potential charges related to interfering with embassy security, even if the interference was unintentional." Late that afternoon, Agent Chen returned with an update. "Ms. Matthews, after reviewing all available evidence and consulting with both embassy officials and federal prosecutors, we've reached a decision about how to proceed." Karen held her breath, preparing for the worst. While your actions did compromise embassy security and created a dangerous situation, the evidence clearly shows that your initial contact with the weapon was accidental. Additionally, your cooperation throughout this investigation and your immediate compliance with instructions to surrender the weapon have been noted. Agent Chen paused, consulting her notes. You're being released with a formal warning. However, you are banned from participating in any demonstrations within 500 feet of this embassy for the next 2 years. Additionally, you'll be required to complete 40 hours of community service focused on conflict resolution and peaceful protest education. The relief that washed over Karen was overwhelming. While the consequences weren't negligible, they were far less severe than the federal charges and potential jail time she had been imagining throughout the day. As Karen left the embassy that evening with her sister and lawyer, she was surprised to find that a small group of reporters was waiting outside. The incident had apparently made local news, and several outlets wanted her statement about what had happened. "I want to be absolutely clear," Karen told the reporters, "that what happened today was a complete accident that occurred during a moment of chaos. I have nothing but respect for the Royal Guards who handled the situation with professionalism and restraint. I'm grateful that no one was hurt, and I take full responsibility for my role in creating a dangerous situation, even though it was unintentional." In the weeks that followed, Karen found herself somewhat notorious in activist circles. Some people criticized her for being careless and giving peaceful protests a bad name. Others defended her, arguing that the incident highlighted how quickly peaceful demonstrations could turn dangerous when aggressive elements inserted themselves into otherwise orderly events. Karen completed her community service requirement by teaching workshops on peaceful protest techniques and crowd safety to local activist groups. Through this work, she met many other people who had found themselves in challenging situations during demonstrations, and she learned valuable lessons about maintaining personal safety while advocating for important causes. 6 months later, Karen received an unexpected letter from Thompson, the young Royal Guard whose rifle she had accidentally grabbed. He thanked her for her cooperation during the incident and her public statements afterward that emphasized the professionalism of the embassy security team. He mentioned that the incident had become part of their training scenarios, helping other guards prepare for similar unexpected situations. Karen kept the letter as a reminder of how quickly life could change and how important it was to think clearly, even in moments of chaos and confusion. She continued her activism work, but with a new appreciation for the complexity of public demonstrations and the potential consequences of even accidental involvement in security incidents. The incident became a story she would tell for years afterward, always emphasizing the lessons she learned about personal responsibility, the importance of peaceful protest tactics, and the human element that exists even in tense confrontations between protesters and security personnel. What had started as her worst day became, in many ways, one of her most educational experiences about the real-world complexities of social activism and civic engagement.